very much, Chair. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to reflect on the Ljubljana guidelines. I'm going to make it quite clear from the outset, I find this document extremely disappointing. In many ways, I think it's very dangerous, and I will try to explain why. It's heavily, in its epistemology, it is heavily legal, bureaucratic, and technical. It ignores sociology, it ignores politics, there's no theory of power in it, there's no theory of culture, there's no social psychology, it has a universalist epistemology, which at the end of the day is fundamentally anti-minority. Now what I did, and that's because I partly come from the Anglo-Saxon tradition, is to subject it to close reading. I'm not going to go through all of it because there are far too many recommendations for me to go through. Have a look at recommendation 1. It's about a sovereign and functioning state as a prerequisite for stable society, sovereignty, etc., etc. Now, to me, what this says is that state power is preeminent. It is sacralized. It may not be questioned. Whereas actually the reality is in the globalized world is that states have become much more fluid. They are much more contingent. They are the products of history. They're not trans-historical, they're not super-hysterical. In a way, if you look at it, if you probe it deeply, this first recommendation is practically a religious concept. The state is something to be worshipped. Now, have a look. I don't know how many of you know this book. It's called The Vanished Kingdoms. It's by my former colleague Norman Davies. It says states come, states go. And I do not see that the 21st century is going to be any different. You will be familiar with what's happening in Catalonia, you will be familiar with what is happening in Scotland. We lived through an extraordinary, unique time between 1944 and 91 when there was no state change in Europe. I think this period is over. I don't see any reflection of this in the recommendations, which is thoroughly regrettable. Let me look very briefly at recommendation 6. Identities are subject to the primacy of individual choice through the principle of voluntary self-identification. Now, that is an illusion. Socialization, forms of collective knowledge, what a society is about. There is no such thing as voluntary self-identification. Voluntary self-identification implies absolute freedom to choose. This is nonsense. But it seems to me that this is where the hand is interred. This is the Hundegraben. It implies that actually individual choice is a reality, whereas in fact it's not, which puts power in the hands of the state to direct these so-called choices in its direction. Recommendation 7, no non-isolationist approach to minority issues, and of course it's always the majority that decides whether or not a collectivity is being isolationist. Again, the same problem, recommendation 8, it's about legitimacy. Who decides? Who decides what legitimate is? Generally, it's the majority. The minority very, very seldom gets the opportunity even to make its own voice heard. Let me move on. Recommendation, I'll skip that one. Recommendation 36. Policies that foresee privileged access to citizenship to individuals abroad based on cultural, historical, familial ties. Now, protecting the rights of minorities is primarily the obligation of the state in which they reside. And what if they don't? And what if that state does not protect the rights of the minority? There are any number of examples of this. I could keep you here for 3 hours talking about places where the states are exactly the opposite. I think this is scandalous myself. Let me move on. Recommendation 49. Measures to promote the state or official languages in the media should not disproportionately curtail the right to use a minority language. Who decides what is disproportionate? You, or the High Commissioner, or actually the state, or the state bureaucrats? I'm sorry, I find this very, very disappointing. So I'll make a few final comments. My general question is, who guards the guardians? Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? The recommendations are naive in trusting that all states are decent, all states are nice, all states basically wash their face in the morning and help old ladies across the street. They're upright, they're civic-minded. They're nothing of the kind. I mean, you must be aware of state theory. We talk about the predatory states. It's the 18th century. The state has been engaged in a process of centralizing, ordering, in many ways, a fundamental conflict between rights and the obligations, and crucially, the control, the reading of the citizens. I don't know if you know James Scott's book, but I strongly commend it to your attention. It's called Seeing Like a State. It's one of the fundamental texts. It came out maybe 10, 15 years ago. He's an American anthropologist. I commend it to your attention. Secondly, I read this epistemological assumption that basically states are all set to be maximally nice towards their minorities. Not true. States actually deeply dislike minorities. It makes their life very difficult. You know, you have these people speaking another language. It makes bureaucracy more difficult, more costly, more tedious, more tiresome. They want to establish a single homogeneous linguistic culture. I've already talked about the legal and technocratic dimension of this. It is as if the political issue has already been settled. Well, it hasn't. The states persist in anti-minority behavior. Have a look, for example, at the problem of dual citizenship, the attitude of Ukraine, the attitude of Macedonia, these preliminary interviews to see if a criminal act is about to be committed by a member of a minority taking on the citizenship of another state. Is that the kind of state behavior that, in a way, says how wonderful states are? Or, I don't know if you've looked, for example, at the figures in Slovakia for the proportion of the population that goes to university, the breakdown between Slovaks and Hungarians. Slovaks are around 20%, the Hungarian minority is about 7 or 8%. I'm sure this testifies to the total equality that's defined in Slovakia. The reality, it seems to me, is that majority-minority relations will always be political. One cannot actually exclude politics, which this is what this report is trying to do, trying to make politics invisible, to depoliticize the issue. There's nothing reprehensible about politics. Politics is the norm in a democracy. Culturally, that's my experience, having lived as a member of a minority of one, if you like, in the United Kingdom for many years. Majorities have extreme difficulty in accepting the presence of a second minority high culture in their state. Minorities will always have to engage in a political struggle from a weaker position. So why I ask myself, why is there no mention in this report of consociation theory? Consociationism accepts the reality of more than one group living on a particular territory with commensurate state power. It's not an easy concept, but it is democratic and does not suppress the minority. I don't see a problem with parallel societies, frankly. At the street level, these parallel societies will find ways of communicating. The moment you bring the state into it, it becomes coercive. What does these recommendations offer in terms of minority cultural reproduction? The answer is very little. It entrusts it to the state, whereas actually we know from looking at the history of this entire issue, going right back into the coming of modernity, 18th, 19th century, that cultural reproduction of a minority demands political power. This is where the question of symbols and rituals come in. You know, have a look at what's been happening in the Preševo Valley. The Serbian state removes an Albanian symbol. It happens to be a statue. Is this good behavior? What are we talking about? I mean, and so on and so forth. I see no mention in this report of the problem of checks and balances. This is essential. This is absolutely the central issue of any democracy, and it has to include the minority. Now, what I see as really difficult, and it is a difficult issue, I don't wish to underestimate it, is the problem of minority agency. Giving the minority the possibility to act as a collectivity in its own right. They are a collectivity. It's no use trying to demolish this. They have a sense of collective self, and they are a part of a collective representation on the part of the majority. That's not going to disappear. There's always going to be a cleavage line. How deep that is, that's another matter. Can we, for example, Minority Agency, imagine a minority pride parade in, say, Bratislava? Can we imagine what would happen? We can imagine, I can see the police beating them up without a second thought. Or a minority pride parade in Bucharest. Can you see it? Because I can't, not at this stage, and I'm not sure what, this point, why it is that we see minorities as being a rather less desirable category than LGBT, for example. In a way, this worries me greatly, because if members of minorities read this report, they will basically see we are expected to assimilate. There are, a few sort of sweeties scattered throughout the text saying it's all right, minorities have certain rights, but I think that it's weighted in favour of majorities, and in that sense, if a minority wants to secure its cultural reproduction, the only way it can do it is by creating instability, which will then bring you in. You remember the postmodern uprising, I think that's a fair way of calling it, in Macedonia by the Albanians. It wasn't real, sort of semi-real, which actually did bring the international community in and did produce the Ohrid Agreement, which worries me greatly, because it seems to be that if the only way that majorities can be brought to the negotiating table is through some level of violence, then we're a very long way from democracy. And I'm just very much afraid that, with all the work that has gone into this text, it's misdirected, it's misguided, it's pointing in the wrong direction because it's helping majorities.